Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining me. This is Tim Laskus, and you're listening to The Tim Laskus Show, episode 69. How many of you out there would love to get started on podcasting, would love to have your own show, put your voice out there and do your thing? I know you want to, and if you're struggling, you don't know where to begin, or maybe you have started and you're just at wit's end, I need some help. Hey, I'm offering podcast coaching. Come on over to timlaskus.com and check out my coaching page, and I can assist you. And there's a couple of different packages to help you get on your way. I'll answer your questions and get you going so that you can have your own show and do all the fun stuff that podcasting brings. All right, now on to today's guest, who is Bobby Klinck. Now, Bobby's he's a Harvard Law School graduate. How cool is that? He's also the founder of Klinck LLC. He's trained as an intellectual property attorney, and he helps entrepreneurs, startups, innovators, and everyone who wants to understand more about intellectual property, reduce exposure to lawsuits, and how to handle anything that comes up. But his real focus is with entrepreneurs. He just breaks it down, and he brings lots of great information. So sit back and enjoy.
The Tim Laskus Show, in search of entrepreneurial gold. Tim digs deep into the minds of his guests, entertaining, down to earth, and informative. Now, here's your host, Tim Laskus.
Hey, Bobby, thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, you were telling me that you are known as the brew master in your area. You're brewing all kinds of beer and all that good stuff. Tell me a little more about that.
Yeah, so I have always been in search of fun things to do, and also for something that can be a bit of a creative release for me. And I don't know, it's probably about 5 years ago now, I saw on Facebook, of all things, one of my high school friends had taken up home brewing again. And I said to my brother-in-law at the time, I said, why are we not doing that? And he said, that's a good question. And so that started me on this quest. And now I brew my own beer. I've got quite a setup with a kegerator that can handle 3 kegs of my own beer. I have a brew structure that I use that I built that took me a lot of time, and it probably weighs about 500 pounds. Maybe not that much, but
wow.
It's an opportunity to go out, spend some time in the great outdoors in my backyard with friends. It takes me about 6 hours or so to do the process. And so I get to sit around and enjoy talking and some fellowship with friends while we're drinking some beer. And hey, guess what? The output is more beer. So it's good all the way around.
Wow. Now, do you like the light beer or the dark beer? Which one are you making?
You know, I make a mix of everything. I make, the funny thing is, one of the first beers that I made that people really turned their heads about was actually a stout, of all things. But the way one of my friends described it is, this is a stout that people who don't like stouts would enjoy, which was kind of an interesting perspective. But I currently brew everything from what's called a Kolsch, which is a German, very light German beer, up to a stout. I actually, right now, one of my taps on my kegerator has a double imperial stout that's about 12.5%, which I then aged on some Starbucks coffee. So it's kind of a caffeine buzz and a strong beer all at the same time.
Wow, that'll give it to you. Man, you ever name one of your brews like the Bobby, get crazy brew? Or, with all that percentage of alcohol, I mean, that's people might be dropping their clothes and running around the neighborhood naked or something.
Well, that hasn't happened yet. I actually, early on, I started just, I came up with a name just for my brewing enterprise. And I did it with the help of my brother, who's a musician who travels in Germany quite a bit for music. And he happened to be with a German while I was talking with him. And so I named my brewing effort Hauptstadt, which is the German word for capital city. And since I'm in Washington, D.C., it seemed fitting. And my beer kind of tends to that style of the German, very balanced, normally not the 12%. But so I use that for my brewing effort. And, I've investigated even making it into a business, but haven't gotten there yet. But for the actual beers, I usually just give them pretty bland names because I want people to know what they are. So I call it a pale ale, or I call it an IPA, just whatever it is by the style.
Gotcha.
I've avoided the catchy puns that a lot of the breweries use these days.
Well, we'll have to have you back on, and we'll just have a whole show on beer. That would be cool.
Happy to do it.
But anyway, tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, Bobby, and what are you currently working on professionally?
Okay. I am an intellectual property attorney in Washington, D.C., but really what I am is I'm a chief IP strategist for entrepreneurs, from online entrepreneurs to startups, and I provide them with overall strategic advice on how they can collect, capture, and safeguard their intangible assets, but also how they can avoid stepping on landmines that could land them in a lawsuit that could cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Can you break down the term intellectual property and what that means?
Yeah, so intellectual property is a kind of a catch-all term that I like to say it refers to anything you own that you can't hold in your hand and isn't a piece of dirt. So anything that's not physical property is intellectual property. There's four pretty classic silos of it. One is a patent, which relates to an invention. The others are trademark, which has to do with branding, slogans, etc. It's anything that designates where a product or service came from. Then you have copyright, which most people understand. That's a right that you have into anything that is creative that you put into fixed form. So it could be something written, music, a video, something like that. And then the final area is trade secrets. And this is, in some ways, the least focused upon, but probably the most important for most entrepreneurs. Anything that has value to your business that's not generally known and that you take reasonable steps to keep confidential is entitled to protection. So classic examples for entrepreneurs are your customer list, your CRM database. If you have any secret sauce to your business, that's protected. So the Coca-Cola formula, for example, is a trade secret. So those are the big areas. There's some small areas like a right to publicity, but that only really applies to the really important people of this world.
So I assume Colonel Sanders has a trade secret for his chicken recipe.
That's right. So that's the other classic, other than the Coca-Cola recipe. The KFC spice mix is a trade secret that is protected.
Gotcha. Well, I had a question. It's a little bit different, but it has to do with the craze that's going on right now with these darn fidget spinners. Are you aware of these things?
I see them all over the place, and I think it's a horrible idea because I would cause a big mess if I had one, but I know of the idea.
But it seems like, from the story I heard, that somebody who had started a long time ago had a patent and the patent expired, and then everybody pounced and started making them. And it seems like it's the Wild West and nobody owns a patent.
Well, that's interesting. That might be true. You will often have patents. So patent, depending on when you filed it, but now if you file a patent, you get protection for 20 years from the date of your initial filing. So if you filed it today, you would have protection until, what would that be, 2037. So often you'll have patents that are kind of ahead of their time. So the ones that end up in lawsuits often are things that were developed for one area and then became big in another area. As one example, a case that I was involved in, there was this patent that the way it was written most likely covered any hotspot on a telephone. So any cell phone that had multiple communication channels and a hotspot. So any phone today, obviously, was covered by this patent. Well, the patent was originally written a long time ago to make it possible. It was developed with these people who were trying to find a way to ensure that the ATMs on riverboat casinos would always be able to have access to data and therefore be able to, give money so that the casinos could make money. But if you think about it, that patent then theoretically covers this huge area. But of course, once it goes out, everybody will adopt the technology. So that's a pretty common theme in the world of patents.
Now, when you have a patent like that and say right before it expires, do you get a nice little email reminder, hey, you have 5 more days and your patent is up? Renew now.
No, you don't. People who have patents will often, so there are there are things you have to do once you get the patent. You have to pay maintenance fees, is what they're called, at certain time periods after it issues. You just have to pay a fee to keep it in force. And those, you have to do it yourself, or you'll have an attorney normally who will kind of ping you and remind you. But quite honestly, when it expires, it really doesn't mean much. Even after your patent's expired, if someone was using it during the period, you could still maybe go and get some, get a payment for people who were using the technology during the period it was valid.
Yeah. Now, what are some kind of common things that your clients are coming to you with? Like, what are you working on kind of right now? What are some kind of examples of entrepreneurial issues that they need your help with?
So they can be all over the place. Often I have entrepreneurs coming to me thinking they have one problem and really they have another. The most common example of that I find is that often I have entrepreneurs coming to me thinking they have purely an intellectual property issue. And what I discover is that actually they have a much more basic issue, that they don't have basic corporate formation documents, for example. So you might have a partnership without a partnership agreement, and that can be an issue generally, but also with intellectual property. So, for example, if one of the two people to the partnership is the one bringing the ideas, well, did they transfer those ideas to the business? If not, they still own it, the business doesn't. So there are fundamental things like that, and that's really one of the big issues I find is people don't have their agreements in writing, but often they don't realize that's their problem.
Gotcha. Now, are you finding that most of your clients come to you as part of being reactive or proactive? Reactive meaning they come to you in stress, like, oh my God, I'm getting sued. Or are they coming to you like, hey, you know what, we're starting this. We just want to make sure we have our bases covered.
It's a mix. Unfortunately, there's too much of it that's reactive. And the problem is that when it's reactive, often it's something that could have been avoided pretty easily. The classic example of that is I will often have people come to me with an issue about a trademark, and it has to do with their brand name. So they've established a company with a brand name, and they did all this work. And there's another one of the big mistakes. People will spend all kinds of time brainstorming, spitballing, split testing, coming up with the perfect name for their business, but then they don't go and check and see if anyone else is using it or has a trademark for it. And if you don't, what happens is, look, the trademark owner, if there is one, isn't going to hear about you when you're brand new. What's going to happen is you're going to spend months, years, maybe developing your brand. And then all of a sudden, when you get to be successful, the trademark owner will hear about you, send you a letter. And I have this happen not infrequently, where they come to me and ask what to do. And the problem is if someone else has the trademark, they probably are going to have to change their name. But again, if you think about it, most names, as great as they are, you could have made some tweaks early on that wouldn't have hurt you if you would have just thought about it, taken the time to figure out if there was an issue and go from there.
Now, is it a common mistake that people make, and they come up with a catchy little name, and then they go in and they onto GoDaddy and they say, oh, the .com name is available, so there must not be any kind of trade issues or trademark or patent or whatever.
Yep. So a lot of people make that mistake. They think if the domain name is available, that means that they can use it. And that's just not the case. It could be for any number of reasons. It could be that, the name you want to use is a particular product name, for example, of a competitor, or they just don't have a domain name, or they have a different domain name. It's a separate issue. Trademarks are protected. As soon as someone starts using a name in commerce, it starts to get protection. You can also file a federally protected or federally registered trademark. The basic amount of due diligence you need to do is search the federal database for the whole name, but also for parts of the name, see if there's anything related. But then you also, just fire up Google and just search your name and related terms and see if anything comes up. You can also get a service to do it for about $200, anywhere from $200 to $400. You can get reports that would include, for example, searching through state Secretary of State's offices to find out if anybody's registered a company under the name, and then to do other more comprehensive searches as well.
Well, and in my kind of quest to search for kind of a show name for me, and I just decided just to use my own name because it's rather, Tim Laskus. There's not too many Tim Laskuses around, so I thought it would be fairly safe. But what if someone has a name that's, Bill Brown, which may be very common, and they say, well, I'm going to just use my name. I don't care how many Bill Browns are out there. Can you get sued for using your own name if you have a common name?
Yeah, I mean, I've never heard of it happening. One of the things, obviously, trademarks can't be used to take generic things out of public use. And I'll actually go back to my beer example. So someone couldn't try to trademark the name Pale Ale because that is a description that's used broadly in the market. And similarly, if you have a common name, someone can't stop you from using it. Again, I'm Klinck LLC is my business. Ironically, there is another lawyer by the name of Klinck, which is not that common of a last name, who happens to be an IP lawyer as well. And I just found that through searching on the internet, but it is what it is. But no, as a general matter, you can use your name without concern.
Okay. All right. Well, good to know. Now, you've been doing this for a while, Bobby, I assume. And so you've learned some things along the way. And what are a couple of tips that you have for kind of starting out entrepreneurs who are on their way and kind of getting their service or product up and going? What are a couple of things that can be very helpful?
Yeah, well, so focusing on the legal issues, we've talked about a couple of them. One is get your agreements in writing. Two is make sure you can use your name. But the big one I would say is just make sure you're thinking about these things and have a plan for what you intend to do. Don't just fly by the seat of your pants. That's the big mistake a lot of people make with this issue, but also more generally. People too often just go with a gut feel without thinking through a problem, and that can lead to a result. There are other specific legal issues that I could point out, but the other broad issue I want to point out is don't let the fear of the cost of a lawyer stop you from dealing with this. One of my favorite quotes is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Sure, it would be great if you could hire me or someone else to really go in and dig into your business and help you come up with a very comprehensive plan. But, if you can't do that, there's free resources out there. You can find some books about it. You can learn online. And you can do a lot of it yourself. Maybe it won't be as good. I'll tell you that. It's not going to be as good as if you hire a professional who really knows these things, but it's better than nothing. And so that's a general theme. Take action, even if it's imperfect action, to move your business forward.
Gotcha. I think so many people kind of have this analysis paralysis sometimes, and they're just looking for everything to be perfect, and they get stuck, and before they know it, months and maybe even years have gone by, and they haven't done anything.
Yep.
So that's awesome. Now, when did you realize, Bobby, that you had this entrepreneurial spirit and that you wanted to really, help entrepreneurs?
Well, so that's an interesting question, because in some ways I should have had an entrepreneurial spirit, and I think I did very early. My father ran a business, chain of drugstores. When I was growing up, I had started working early, delivering papers. And one of my first true entrepreneurial moments was in high school. I had this class, I think it was my junior year or something, we had a late lunch period. And one of the guys that I had class with right before lunch would pay me $5 for my sandwich. And when I took my lunch, so I started having my mom make me 2 sandwiches without telling her that I was selling one to him and eating one myself. But so that was my first entrepreneurial venture, I think. But, when I first became a lawyer, I went a much more traditional route of working at big firms on behalf of big companies in big, huge disputes. And I felt frustration. At the time, I thought my frustration had more to do with a lack of working on specific tasks, meaning not getting enough responsibility to do that task and that task. And what I found was eventually I made the shift, and it was about, 7 years ago. About 7 years ago that I joined a very entrepreneurial law firm. And I realized that was what was missing. It was this inability to, really express myself. And that's only really accelerated after I went out on my own about 3 years ago. I have found that, diving even deeper into the entrepreneurial spirit, but also serving entrepreneurs, is what really gets me excited. And that was a revelation that came, when I went out on my own. It was unexpected. and because of a mistake I'd made of not getting a deal in writing with my prior firm. So ironically, I made one of the mistakes that I counsel against. But so I went out on my own, and I made the classic mistake of trying to cast as wide a net as possible and say, I'll do anything for anybody. Then I started working with a business coach, and she said, well, what kind of lawyer are you? And so that's when I finally put the stake in the ground and said, hey, I'm an intellectual property lawyer. She said, well, what industry do you work for? And that was when I said, And she thought I was going to say computers or software or Internet of Things or something like that. And when I thought about it, I'd been listening to entrepreneurial podcasts for a while at that point. I had already dug down into inbound marketing and all these other concepts that online entrepreneurs use. And I said, you know what I really want to do is work with entrepreneurs. And so that was the moment. And it really has changed everything for me because now I know exactly who I'm talking to. I can give a message that's directed right to the people that I want to serve. And I can focus on the issues that they really need me to address. So that has been a huge shift. And it's been, 2.5 years now or so, 2.5 years that I've been doing that.
Great. Well, it sounds like you really found, your calling and what you're passionate about. And you talked about your experience with a coach, and which is what I recommend everyone really do, is have someone to work with you to help you get clear, on your vision and your plan and where you're going. So that's wonderful, Bobby. Now, the next kind of series of questions is called the dig round. And I just want you to kind of answer very quickly. And the first is, what keeps you motivated?
That's easy. It's my daughter. I have a 3.5-year-old who is my why, and she's also how I structure my business. I want to make sure that my business allows me to be an active part of her life and to be there for her and for the various events in her life.
For sure. Well, I have a 3.5-year-old as well, and I found myself drinking Monster and Red Bulls to keep up with him. How about you? Do you have the energy?
Well, yeah. She can be tough, especially if my wife and I, have a night out, and you have to remember my daughter's waking up at 6:30 the next day, no matter what, and so am I. So it can be tough, but it's joy, and I don't complain about a minute of it.
For sure. Now, who do you look up to as a business leader?
I think from a first perspective, I look to my father and think about the role that my father played in my life. But, nowadays I look up to and take guidance from a lot of the luminaries who have, important podcasts, people like John Lee Dumas, who, I think does a great service. And quite honestly, finding his podcast is what really first took me down this path. So I follow him and listen to his podcast. And I find that I'm constantly buying new books as a result and, constantly learning.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, I started out listening to him as well, and he's a great resource and very motivating, and has lots of interesting interviews with people from all over. Mm-hmm. Now, Bobby, you have a choice. Choose between street smarts or book smarts, and you can only have one. Which one are you going for?
Street smarts.
Street smarts, but you spent all that time in books to become an attorney. Why are you get rid of the books?
Well, because a lot of my classmates from Harvard Law School are really smart people, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be successful and smart. At the end of the day, hustle and implementation and that other element, the it factor that has nothing to do with book smarts, is, I think, much more important to your success long term. I think it's important to have both, but if I had to choose one, I'd go with street smarts. Gotcha.
So you're saying understanding theory doesn't necessarily help you to understand practice.
Yep. And again, I could look at it in the world of attorneys. The richest attorneys tend not to be the ones who went to the best law schools. They're the people who didn't go to the top law schools but had to hustle. And I think that's true in business as well. So, I think that is, in a sense, the most important piece.
Gotcha. Now, since you've been on your own for a while and you're trying to get your own self established, what's been a kind of a stressful moment for you mentally, during this journey of this entrepreneurial journey of yours, and how did you cope?
Well, so I deal with stress on a pretty regular basis. When I first went out on my own, I was focused exclusively on litigation, so lawsuits. I was not advising people. And the problem with that is the cases that I handled tend to be big cases, take a lot of time. So, hey, when you're busy, great, but you can't have a lot of cases going at once. So you could have a case end, and all of a sudden you have a potential cliff in your revenue. And that led me, in a sense, to one of my first pivotal moments. I was doing well, got busy, had multiple cases going at once. I had put out an ad to hire someone. Originally, I was thinking of an intern, but I found my first employee who's an attorney, and I hired her on. And I think between the time I gave her the offer and then she came to start, one of the cases, it became clear that the client actually wasn't going to be able to pay. So all of a sudden that case kind of goes away. And then within a month, I think, or so of hiring her and her actually starting, the case that was bringing in pretty much all the revenue settled and went away. And so all of a sudden I find myself with a person on my payroll, and I think at the time, literally, I had no revenue coming in. So that was a scary moment. And, I coped by putting my head down, digging in. Ironically, that's when I hired the business coach. And so if you think about it, most people at that point wouldn't have done that. They would have said, hey, stop spending money. I'm not going to spend any money. But instead, I went the other way. I said, look, I need to get help with this. And so I hired a business coach, and like I said, the way I ultimately dealt with it was changing my focus. But, I coped by just saying, I don't really have a choice. I have to cope, and let's go and let's do it. And so that, I guess, was my coping mechanism.
So it sounds like you doubled down and said, hey, I'm in it. I'm going to learn. I'm going to figure this out, and I'm not going to run from it, and invest in yourself.
Yep.
That's great. And I'm glad you did not say that you kind of wallowed in your beer. You drank more beer and just stayed drunk in your backyard for days on end.
That wouldn't have done me much good.
For sure. Now, what would you say has been one of the most fulfilling moments of your entrepreneurial journey?
I think that there are lots of them I can think of when I see the effect that I have. So I have one client right now that I'm representing. He's actually an individual inventor, and he had handled a patent application himself for a long time. I got involved, and I don't actually handle filing patents and doing that, because it's better to hire someone who just does that exclusively. But so I got him hooked up with an attorney that I use pretty frequently, and now he's gotten 2 more patents issued, which are incredibly strong and look wonderful, and are giving him a pretty fulsome level of protection. So that's one example of something I'm proud of, but it's a small thing. And to me, my proud moments are often in seeing my clients succeed and in getting a good result for them, and seeing them be happy. So that's where I see my success.
Yeah, for sure. So it sounds like you gave great value, and then this person, in turn, your client, was able to benefit tremendously and to kind of see them grow and prosper from your assistance.
Yep. And that's the joy I get to see, is I, in a sense, get to participate in all of the value that my clients are creating for the world by helping them to make sure that they continue to do that.
Yeah, and then you get to brag on them and say, hey, look how successful he is. And I was a small part along, his journey, so that him or her. So that's excellent. Well, Bobby, we've come to the end of the show, but before we go, tell the listeners where they can find you online, your website, and all that great information.
Okay, so my website is just klinkllc.com. So that's KLINCK LLC.com. And if you go there, I have a lot of free resources, free information. I have a blog that kind of covers the basic information that entrepreneurs need to know about intellectual property and various parts of it. Also, I have a free course that people can take. It's an email course about the 5 biggest legal mistakes. They're obviously related to IP, but the 5 biggest legal mistakes that entrepreneurs make that could potentially sink their business. And they can get that free course at klinkllc.com/mistakes. So that's how you find me. On social media, I'm most active on Twitter, and that's at Bobby Klinck, BOBBY KLINCK. I post some about intellectual property, but some just about business and marketing and things that I think are interesting to folks in my space.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, Bobby, will you be offering to the first 2 people who signed up for your course all the beer they can drink?
I wish I could. I'm not sure how I could ship it, but I'll tell you what. For the first 2 people who signed up for my course, if they find their way to Washington, D.C., I'd be happy to share a beer with them.
There you go. Awesome. That's incredible. Well, Bobby, thank you very much for your time. You've been fantastic, and I really appreciate you being here and just bringing great value.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Want more entrepreneurial tips? Go to timlaskas.com.